Well, it's great to have with us here the Finance Minister, Mr. Arun Jaitley, and I guess I can take a shrewd guess as to what most of the people in this room will want to know about, because if this session is about changing India, well, you've certainly changed India, and you've changed it rather dramatically in the last month or so. So a lot of short-term pain, a lot of long-term gain, and I think that's the way you also described it. Any particular preference of which of them you want to talk about first?
Go ahead.
All right, let's just kickstart it then with figuring out when this decision was actually taken, sir, and whether Mr. Naresh Agarwal was right in saying that perhaps even you didn't know.
Well, that I'll keep you guessing. But you can imagine from the enormity of prior preparation which is required. And the prior preparation is that if you are to replace 86% of a country's cash currency, then obviously you have to have a substantial part of it in readiness from the very moment that the replacement is to take place. And from what I now have understood in the last few months, security printing of currency is a fairly complicated exercise. It's a time-consuming exercise. How time-consuming you can guess that if you were to replace the exiting currency with identically the same denomination, it doesn't get reprinted in months. The estimates vary, so it's far more than that. And therefore, the readiness has to begin several months in advance. And in order to have a replacement in place, you not only must have a substantial currency ready, both the RBI and the Government of India presses must continue, as days pass by, continue to print furthermore as the remonetization process takes place. But the very moment the decision is announced, immediately you have to reach 133,000 branches of banks. You have to reach 155,000 post offices. You reach there through almost 4,000 currency chests. There are about 200,000 ATMs which will require post-announcement to be recalibrated. And in rural areas where you don't have a bank branch in every village, you have about 125,000, of which about 86,000 are active banking correspondents or bank mitras, as they call them. So you have almost several lakhs points of exchange which are there. And therefore, not only there must be readiness in terms of printing of substantial amount, it must reach the currency chest, and then it must be ready within 24 hours to start a redistribution from all these points. So you can imagine the enormity, and it's a challenge that the decision has to be kept a closely guarded secret. And only on a need-to-know basis, people must know exactly that part of the information that they are required to know.
So a certain amount of chaos and confusion was, I guess, only to be expected in an exercise of this magnitude. But you were talking about the printing of notes, and that's one of the questions that people have had, if there is a reason that banks seem to be unable to give enough money, and that's why the queues are there, people having to come back and again and again.
I'll tell you, see, this was to be expected. When you are replacing a currency, obviously the Reserve Bank calibrates the release. Now you've seen in the last few weeks that if you they release the entire thing in one go, then there were market malpractices also which were visible. And therefore, the remonetization process is not instantaneous. It will be spread over a couple of weeks. And once the remonetization takes place, and therefore there's a certain amount of currency the central bank releases every day through the banking system, but when the pay time comes, there will be longer queues. Otherwise, after the first 5-7 days, they started settling down. They had taken a decision that they would have some exchange, which was a practice which after the first 3-4 days, they realized that which was being abused by many people. And therefore, you have to keep changing your strategy itself. But the principal point is that even though in such a large exchange covering such a large section of population, there will be queues. But that was only to be expected. That was a part of the decision which was factored in. But the fact is that people have cooperated immensely. Yeah. The fact that you have 86% of the currency taken out and slowly you are having liquidity released almost every day, and you don't find a social unrest anywhere in the country. The fact that the queues are by and large disciplined. When your colleagues means friends from the media, go there, and even leading questions are asked. You literally put your hand in their mouth and say, "Are you not very angry?" He says, "Yeah, I am troubled, but I'm very happy this decision has been taken." So, and you can see it almost every day that this seems to be happening. And I think the country, by and large, has welcomed the decision.
And I think that's because many people are seeing the long-term gains, and we will come to that and discuss that in some detail. But it's always wiser, I guess, easier to be wiser after the event. But if you look back at the decision and what could have been done, do you think perhaps more notes could have been printed upfront before the decision, and especially 500 rupee notes, because the 2,000 rupee notes that are coming have their own challenges. It's tough to get change for that.
I think the period over which the preparation time goes on is extremely important. So you'll have the same volume of 500 rupee notes, but in terms of value, it would be 1/4 the value. And therefore, if you require a certain level of printing in terms of value, not in terms of just volume of currency, in a replacement, the higher denomination made it easier, because that printing then would take half the time.
Right. When you're talking about how long this period is going to take now to replace all the currency, now we've seen estimates ranging from 4 months to 7 months. What would be your own guess of how long it will be before full normalcy returns?
I'll tell you, the process of remonetization, till the 30th of December, you'll have a very significant part of the currency which would have been released into the market. Now, obviously, one of the advantages of this exercise is going to be that you won't have the same level of paper currency which existed on the 8th of November being released. That's never going to be. One of the advantages of this exercise is that you will reduce the quantum of paper currency and take the country more towards a digital currency or for a further digitization. And that almost already seems to be happening, partly because people are now changing their way of spending, changing the way of doing business. The shortage of the currency itself on some people is forcing this to happen. But that's a development which is for the much better. So the volume of formal trade, the volume of business, all this will grow in size, but the level of paper currency will shrink. And therefore, you should not expect the same level of paper currency that you had on the 8th of November coming back to the market. It will be lesser, but the balance would be replaced by other different modes. It will be debit cards, credit cards, it will be e-wallets, and that's almost seemed to be happening. And while you are at this question, without getting into how individual businesses are changing, for instance, today, it came to me as a surprise personally when I was informed by the chairpersons of banks in a meeting that between credit cards and debit cards, there are 80 crores today in circulation, of which 45 crores have become in active circulation. Don't forget, you have only 25 crore families in India, and that includes people living below the poverty line. You almost have 23 crore e-wallets, something which started less than 1.5 years ago, which are already in circulating. So I yesterday somewhere said that both in politics and in media, we find it difficult to digest these figures, but the country is changing much faster than what we think it is changing.
I guess the concern would always be that it's much easier to have debit cards and credit cards and e-wallets among the affluent in the cities, and people who have smartphones, proper phones. Perhaps the impact is going to hit more on the poorest of the poor.
No,
right? So,
Vikram, that's not correct. You are more technology person than I am, but the presentation which has been made by various banks and various other institutions like the UPI, etc., this exercise now also goes beyond the smartphones itself.
feature phones also. With
Yeah,
the
it goes to the
star
feature phones
99 hash.
with the feature phones also. And if you look at the numbers, this numbers doesn't merely relate to the affluent Indian, as you say. It probably is now penetrating much faster. From the affluent, it went to the aspirational, and from the aspirational, I think it's now percolating downwards. The figures are staggering if you see the number of people who are getting into this exercise. And what's eventually going to happen is that people in trade, for instance, if you have a market and there are, let's say, 5 competitors in a particular commodity in a market or in a particular service. Now, 3 of them have a point of sale machine and 2 don't. So the 2 are going to lose out on competition. And therefore, with volumes increasing, these machines are becoming cheaper. I waived off all duties on them to make them more cheap. And the effect is going to be that in terms of sheer spread over the next few months or so, I'm not even saying years, I'm talking of a few months, the increase is going to be several hundred, several thousand%.
Right, and that, of course, will be a transformation. Just to let everyone in the audience know, in case you do have any questions, a new format this time, you please do write your questions down and somebody will collect it on the floor and I'll take it in about 15, 20 minutes or so. We've heard various estimates as to the extent of disruption that might have been caused in this particular quarter. One estimate saying 2% impact on GDP. What is your own sense of how much disruption and dislocation there may have been?
Well, I think it's extremely difficult at this initial stage to estimate this. But that's something to be factored in. When you switch over and look at the magnitude of the switching over, a particular way of doing business, a particular way of leading life, conducting your expenditure to a different way, I think it does create a disruption, but I don't see the disruption lasting very long. You may see an impact for a quarter or so, and then when you look at the next 12 or 15 quarters, it's going to certainly benefit. Now, let's see what are the immediate trends I have. What is the Rabi sowing this season? Because I see, watch news items on rural distress. It's higher than last year. I saw today morning headlines of a mixed nature in the pink papers on automobile sales. Now, a dip was to be expected, but that kind of a dip hasn't taken place. If 2 car sales have gone down, the other 4 products have gone up. And if that happens in November, which is probably the most challenging month in this exercise, then I think the kind of disruption need not be overstated. But of course, you will have some disruption created because of the switchover. But I think in the long run, the advantages are going to be huge as far as the relative cost of this disruption is concerned.
Well, let's now move our attention to some of those advantages. And obviously, in addition to counterfeit currency and fighting terrorism, which are smaller parts of it, I guess, the big message was that this is going to be a major blow against black money. And frankly, if there are people who are standing out there in line, taking the pain, you're correct. By and large, they're doing it in good spirits, and it's because they think this is going to be a decisive blow against black money. As you've been monitoring the exercise, have you been concerned at all that a significant part of that black money could be getting laundered? You know, we keep hearing reports about, you know, people being caught with large sums of money.
Let me look at the more positive aspects of this. You see, today we are in the 70th year after independence. And if you look back all the 70 years, aspiring from a developing economy to become a developed economy. We are at a stage where we claim last 2 years we've been the fastest growing economy in the world. Probably this year, again, we may continue in that position. Bright spot, sweet spot. But these are all the adjectives which for the first time in history are being used for us. Now look at the other aspect. In terms of our way of life, what was the normal that we had in India? I've said this earlier, so I'm just repeating it. You go and buy a property, X amount in cash, X amount in check. You go and start a trade, wholesale or retail, so much in the kacha khata and so much in the pakka khata. Do developed economies behave like this? We in the political parties go for collecting election funds, and it's the world's largest democracy still has a lot of hush-hush about the way elections and politics is going to be funded. These are only some aspects. Workman, you pay him in cash and avoid the minimum wage. School teachers, private institutions, you pay one amount, you get a signature on the other. Now, this has been for 7 decades the Indian normal. Now, we could allow this to continue because this has continued for such a long time. And I think one of the reasons which was contributing to this, and if you could evade taxes, why not? And if you look at the impact of tax evasion, the impact of tax evasion is that eventually your budgets are deficit both in the center and the states. To spend about 500,000 on the entire developmental budget of this country and then say we are not able to get rid of poverty, we are not able to do much for the rural areas, we are not able to do much for the slums. That's the kind of amount you are looking at when you spend on the entire development budget outside your fixed expenditures. Now, is this normal to be continued? Because it's a very cozy situation, then you don't have to take steps. Now, somehow to confront this normal and create a new normal. So I think when you come to the economic advantages, they'll all follow in the long run. The economic advantages would be, in the first instance, and I think this is the most important, and that's why this received popular support, that everybody knew what the Indian normal was, and if somebody is making an effort to change this, why not? And that's why it attracted a big support. A kind of premium was placed on honesty. And then the obvious advantages, Vikram, that you'll have, today you have monies now already flowing into the banking system. The Indian economy, even last 2 years when we've been fast growing compared to the rest of the world, we haven't had the advantage of banks being able to support growth. We haven't had the advantage of private sector expansion, investment having expanded. You needed money from the budget to recapitalize the banks. Now, all those advantages come in. These volumes can now be used for a more developmental activity. Your rates will now hopefully at some stage come down. More money within the taxation system itself, the base itself increases. And I think our way of its impact on both the socio-economic life of India is going to alter.
So let's just go into some of that in detail. And there are 2 aspects to fighting black money. There's the stock of black money on a particular date, on November the 8th. This is the stock of black money, and clearly demonetization directly, well, hopefully hits that. And then there's the flow of money, which is what you're talking about, a new normal. How will future black money be generated, and can it be stored in 2,000 rupee notes, and so on and so forth. Let's just look at each of these in turn. So when you're looking at the stock aspect of it, one of the figures that I'm sure everyone is going to look at, and you in particular, is the amount of currency that is going to be deposited with the banks by the 31st of December. Because if there were 14 lakh crores out there in 500 and 1,000 rupee notes, if all of that comes back, then either it's been laundered or there was no black money to start with. It's about 8.5 has been redeposited, and the banks would have a certain amount.
I'm not getting into the figure, but let me tell you, I think a very significant advantage is going to be as far as future India is concerned. Don't forget, as far as the past is concerned, this is not the only action. As far as the past is concerned, we first opened a window for the foreign bank accounts. We've now had a lot of initiatives in international cooperation, so that over the next 1 or 2 years, you really start getting real-time information of who's doing what outside. You then had a very successful IDS. You've had various laws being toughened, really, for action against people who were illegally laundering money. So all that is a parallel exercise going on. There are two other parallel exercises. Once the GST is implemented, then generation from businesses itself is going to become far more difficult, because it's a more efficient tax system where any limb of the transaction is captured in the IT backbone. And then you have restrictions on user, the PAN card requirements, etc., which we are all introducing. So this is just one step. As far as the existing is concerned, you are right. From the kind of whispers I get, people are making efforts how to beat the system today and how to get it into the system. But this is not going to be the last day, the fact that you deposit it. And therefore, don't forget, I've also made, factoring this in, changes in the Income Tax Act, which have been cleared by the Lok Sabha, which are now pending before the upper house for a further discussion. And hopefully over the next few days, they'll be notified. So therefore, you will probably have accountability levels of people who either don't deposit or people who made the deposit and then will be subject to this exemplary taxation.
Is there an expectation in your mind that if the entire amount doesn't come back, there is a windfall gain of some sort, which will be with the RBI? You talk about other benefits, that, potentially a lot of the money could come in as tax. There's people who are feeling that the government may end up with a gain, whether you can argue that it's 1 lakh crores or 2 lakh crores, which you can either use to give a budget bonanza this year or deploy in other ways.
No,
is that part of your calculation?
Inflow could come from 3 different ways. One, money within the banking system, which comes as CASA deposits in current account and saving accounts, which is very low cost deposit. And therefore, the ability of the banks to use that money for a reasonable cost lending in various activities, social, infrastructure, industry, trade, it suddenly improves. So that boosts the economy. There could be another limb that monies which are not deposited then go to the credit of the RBI, and that money can be constructively used in some manner. And of course, the third limb, the immediate advantage that you will get of these monies which have even been deposited and which are liable for exemplary taxation, that's the third limb. And the fourth limb obviously is that for future, the base of taxation, both direct and indirect, would expand.
And are you factoring in any sum in your own head as to how much you were expecting from this?
Well, I am not calculating figures because, as you and I know, and I think that was the undertone of your question, probably rightly so, that many people in India, we are still in the process of a change, at a cusp of a change, and therefore many people in India are trying to beat the system. And those who think they can beat the system, the battle between them and the taxman will still continue.
But that actually brings me now to the future flow, because people are saying, look, this is great, one-time exercise, but if you are to really prevent black money from being generated in the future, there are various ways of doing it. And some would argue that the very system that you're talking about and the way it exists, including the tax officers, the tax system, if you were to ask a lot of people in the room, and you're certainly to ask a lot of people outside, they would say one of the major reasons they don't pay their taxes, it's not only because they want to save that 20% or 30%, it's also because they don't want to attract. You should be having a system where you pay your tax and you buy peace. After that, you sleep soundly. In India, only 1 or 2 or 3%, actually are paying taxes, and they are sometimes the ones who are harassed the most.
That's a very poor alibi.
You have to find a way of making sure that there's a simpler tax compliance.
That's an unacceptable reason. A tax non-compliant person can't say, because paying tax would invite further headaches. Let me give you some bare data. And this is not corporate India, this is the average citizen. You have about, let's say, 4.5 crore people filing returns in India. You have some people who are subjected to compulsory tax deduction at source. So this figure doesn't become more than 5.5 crores or so in a country of 125 crores. Now, of these people who file returns, are you aware of the fact that all returns go on the computer system directly to a central system? There is no human face. There are some red alerts that come, and at the end of the day, those red alerts indicate who's to be picked up for a scrutiny. You have a lot of cash withdrawal, you have a lot of cash deposit, you have some big property transactions. Now, those are the kind of red alerts. And out of these people, at the end of the day, some 300,000 people are picked for a scrutiny every year. So at the end of the day, you have about 4% or so of the total population, which is an assessee. Out of these 4%, just 1%, that is out of these 4.5 lakh people, 4 crore people who file their return, you have some 300,000 who are picked up for scrutiny. And therefore, to have a casual dinner time conversation and say in a drawing room, well, I don't pay taxes because I find I'll be scrutinized. Well, that's the number that gets scrutinized. That's a very poor alibi.
So would you say, if you're saying a new normal has to come, would you visualize that new normal should be in India 6 months, 1 year, 2 years down the line, where a much wider tax net exists, a lot more people are actually there paying tax, they are moderate taxation, which is already the case in India, and it's a simple, headache-free process. So people have no problems in complying, and then if anybody doesn't pay their tax or is paying bribes or anything else, then they get caught. Is that what you think the new normal should be?
Well, for instance, even in the current GST negotiations in the Council, the proposal of the central government, and the state governments by and large are in agreement with that of all the people who will be subjected to indirect taxation, that will be the goods and services tax, which means your service tax, your present VAT, your central excise, all taken together, the total number of cases which will be taken up for assessment, the others would be assessed on a self-assessment basis. So you'll have about 95% of the people who will be assessed either by the central authority or the state authority on a self-assessment basis. Today, each person gets assessed at least thrice in each of these 3 major taxations that I mentioned. Now you will only be assessed once. And what one authority assesses, the others will have to accept that same assessment. And therefore, the effort is to make it far simpler. Your rates have to become more reasonable. Obviously, as the base increases, the rates will become simpler, more moderate. But the base has to increase for that.
There may be people who will see in that a hint for budget 2017. Or
no, I've already, it's not a secret. Because in the last 2 years, I've already announced my intention as far as corporate taxes are concerned, at a more globally acceptable and a compatible level, to bring them down to 25%, which is probably one of the most reasonable ones in the world.
All right, here's a question from Achal Khanna, and perhaps it touches in with one of those aspects of preventing future creation of black money, which is, of course, political funding. So he has a question saying, will the BJP be the first party to raise funds from elections via check and do not to take cash donations?
Well, I think when this decision has been taken, you must remember, when Mr. Vajpayee was the Prime Minister, at that time in his government, I had initiated this move as the Law Minister. And we'd amended the Companies Act to create a provision where companies could give up to a maximum cap for political donations. The cap was maximum 5% of their profits. The Income Tax Act was amended to provide this as a permissible expenditure. And political parties were exempted from taxation provided they make a complete disclosure. So the first step we have already taken. Now, some movement over the last 15 years in this direction has taken place, but I still would concede that this is not an adequate enough of a movement. And I think the current move will now create a situation where funding will become far more transparent. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the donors will also say, where do I bring this money from? And therefore, the only donation I can give is legitimate check donation, and that's how it should be.
Okay, that you think will be the new norm. Now, if you're talking about political parties and the political repercussions of this, the Trinamool Congress in particular, I think, has been rather agitated, and we've also been just recently seeing the army being dragged into a row as well yesterday. But specifically, questions were asked by the West Bengal finance minister of the impact that this is going to have on GST and the possibility of a delay in GST. So how would you react to that? That's questions.
Well, first of all, the Constitution doesn't permit a delay in the GST. We notified the goods and services tax on the 16th of September 2016. And the Constitution amendment itself says that the existing system of taxation can continue for 1 year, after which the GST has to come in. So if on the 16th of September 2017, there is no GST, then there is no taxation. So you have a constitutional compulsion to have a GST in place before the 16th of September 2016. Otherwise, the country doesn't run, because tax is absolutely essential. And therefore, our intention is to make sure that it gets implemented from the 1st of April 2017. That was the original intention. I personally believe that once the remonetization process is completed and GST is implemented, it will hugely impact on India's businesses as also on the Indian way of life. You will probably have more of digitized expenditure. You will have a taxation system which is far more efficient, which is extremely difficult to evade, where each limb of the transaction is being captured on the IT support system. You will have goods and services, one big market, that's the whole country. You won't have trucks waiting outside a city or outside a state, spending days before they can enter there. You will have a uniform rate of taxation. You won't have tax on tax, so your products and services can become much cheaper. And with a more efficient indirect taxation system and more transactions within the banking system, rather than what had been happening, I think the way of doing business would be different. The two, according to me, when taken together, I said this yesterday and I'm repeating, would be game changers. On the contrary, the states must welcome it. And I can only tell you, if some states are seen as opposing every reform, then investors in this country and investors coming from outside the country will also then be deciding which are the states in which they must invest. So if a state is always seen as being on the wrong side of every reform, then investors are going to be very wary of those states.
So it's in a sense almost interesting that people keep asking for big bang reforms and faster reforms, and here the argument I think being made is two big bang reforms so fast, one after the other, will the economy be able to take it? You're reasonably confident that it will.
Well, I'm glad you framed your question this way, because for the last 2 years I was only being asked, you're doing a lot of things, but where is the big bang? Now today you're asking a question, can we afford a big bang?
No, I'm saying a double big bang is what... That's what Amit Mitra essentially was asking, that can you do two big bangs in a row? But
I think if you look at the temperament of this country, there are always sections which are reluctant to accept any change. But if you look back the last 30 years, in early 80s, what was the most important issue we were debating? Does India need a color television? I think we spent a lot of time in the media debating this. Oh, it's a waste of national resources. You don't need a color television. I have a lovely anecdote which I remember. In 1996, we had a BJP conference in Mumbai where Mr. Advani announced Mr. Vajpayee as our prime ministerial candidate. So it was a big conference, and to organize that, we needed a better communication system. So for the first time as a party, we bought 7 mobile phones. So your colleagues in the print media at that time didn't report our resolutions or our decisions. They only made fun of us for using mobile phones. 1996. In 2000, I was a member of a GOM, a group of ministers, which was discussing the transformation, the difference between WLL and the normal mobile. And our then telecom minister, Mr. Paswan, used to refer to the mobile as Amir Admi ka phone. So just 15 years ago, if somebody had suggested that every poor man in India will carry a mobile phone or every Dalit will have a mobile phone, most of us would have been in disbelief. And then over the next 10 years, it did happen. Now, the way things are changing in India, will we have a more digitized economy? You can't defy technology. That's bound to happen. I think this decision has only accelerated it. And therefore, the consequences of this are obvious. Some people will be reluctant to accept this. After all, 1991, wasn't Dr. Manmohan Singh completely isolated in the Congress Working Committee as to what direction you are taking the economy in? The party was still speaking in terms of the economy can only be grown through the commanding heights of the public sector. And here is this man trying to free up the economy itself. Now, we find it difficult to accept new ideas, but I think once they are implemented, each one of these changes has been for the better.
Right. Well, just moving to a couple of other subjects before we end. So, coming to the politics of it, it's interesting that the BJP seems to have won election after demonetization, from the northeast to Gujarat to Maharashtra. The impact of this, you think, on UP? Well, perhaps not least because there's probably been a big bang done on various cash reserves of various parties there.
Well,
that was a good surgical strike.
I think in UP, we were already ahead in the race. And the manner in which this decision seems to have created a public opinion, I think is all the more better. And I do believe that for the BJP to be projected as a party which is on the right side of technology, which is trying to represent India, which is more aspirational, which is to grow much faster, and for our opponents to take a more retrograde position, I think is a polarization that perfectly suits us.
Well, there are a couple of other issues which have probably been dominating the headlines completely if it wasn't so much for cash. So one, of course, is the situation with Pakistan. And are you at all concerned as to what's happening? There seems to be a total deterioration of relations, and the situation on the line of control is obviously much worse than it was a year ago.
It's a very serious situation. And if you've seen right from the day that this government has been formed, and even prior to that, even when you had the earlier government, India has always taken a position which was one step after the other, honestly trying to improve relations with Pakistan. The present Prime Minister took a lot of initiatives. From day one, he took the initiatives, inviting the Pakistani Prime Minister, having a surprise stopover there. So these were all unconventional initiatives also that he took. But then the response was a Pathankot or an Uri. And I think there also that this can't be the normal as far as Indo-Pak relationships are concerned. And if there are tensions, I think it's for Pakistan to introspect really why there are tensions.
Right, the other international development which would have again been making headlines if it wasn't that you'd done this on the 8th was the election of Donald Trump and what that might mean not just for the United States but for the rest of the world. Have you had any time to really sit and think about that or reflect on that?
Well, I think this was an unusual election as far as the United States is concerned, but when one of the world's most powerful democracies, through a fair electoral process, takes a decision in an election, we have to accept that decision and we have to work with the American presidency, whichever the presidency is. And I have not the least doubt that India's relationship with the United States would continue to be on the same plank as it was, probably growing and maturing almost by the day.
All right. I think we have enough time for a couple of more questions, which I will take. So Rinesh Puri has this question. Any thoughts on how you propose to deal with the causes of generation of black money in the future? And there are 4 or 5 questions along that theme that have come. Again, ties up with the future flow. So the causes, what would be the causes of that? Is it just to evade tax? Is it to pay bribes? Is it for other reasons? Is it in the real estate sector?
I think our way of conducting our economy, the manner in which we were doing it, was primarily responsible. Our high rates of taxation was another reason, where people found it, there was some incenting in evading black money. As the base increases, as you tend to use more and more technology, and by evolution of your own regulations, you can try and reduce it. Will we be able to eliminate it immediately? It's a big challenge. And therefore, each one of these steps, and I'm saying this at the cost of repetition, which are now being taken, rationalization of the tax structures, having a more modern indirect tax system, a more efficient indirect taxation system, having restrictions on users, stricter implementation, because stricter implementation will also have to follow. Because the kind of stories we heard on the midnight of 8th, how some stores kept open through the night and the kind of trade which is going on, how do we accept that? And I think I have no hesitation in saying that some of the complaints that we've been receiving with regard to the manner in which some individual in the banking system may have behaved. Now, all this, once you toughen these systems, you can create a disincentive against black money.
Right. And if you're looking at I'm just going to get you before we end to look at the crystal ball in a sense and say the next 2 or 3 months and then 1 year or 2 years out. So in the next 1 or 2 months, how soon are the disruptions going to actually end? And more specifically, some of the changes that we've been seeing at a very frequent level, and people will say that this is the government being responsive. That's why so many new rules, regulations are coming up. Should this happen? Should that happen? 2,000 one day, 4,000 the other day. Is that going to start to settle down, or will that continue?
I think it's settling down because for the reason you didn't want to disrupt life. So you gave exemption on tolls, you allowed old currency on petrol pumps, you allowed an exchange. And after 2-3 days, you realized that the exchange facility was being misused. Because the moment you brought in the indelible ink, the queues disappeared, which itself was an evidence of the fact that the exchange facility was being misused. Now that you've had a substantial amount of money which has been redeposited, the old currency, with the banks itself, the rationale of continuing it in petrol pumps, etc., didn't really exist. And therefore, these are all exemptions which have been phased out. You're being responsive. You are watching the market situation on a day-to-day basis. There's nothing wrong in that. I do believe that with every passing day, the remonetization process will go on. Will the Reserve Bank abruptly one day put all the currency into the banks? The answer, probably it won't. It will continue to do so on a daily basis till the 30th of December. and if necessary for a period beyond that, so that the remonetization process is slowly and gradually gets over, and as more and more currency spreads. And as currency is spreading, this tendency of hoarding legally tendered currency also has to come to an end. Because once the remonetization process is completed, there is no advantage in holding that currency. And I think this special effort and a campaign that we are making for a more digitized user itself is an extremely successful campaign. In establishments which deal with the consumers in the retail sector, many consumers are moving in that direction. It's easier, it's cleaner, and probably it doesn't generate black money.
Right, and in the long term, I mean, we are still the fastest growing economy in the world. So looking at it 1 year from now, would you be very confident that will
I have
continue,
not the least doubt in my mind. You will be a bigger economy, you will have a higher GDP, you will have a cleaner GDP, you will have a higher tax base, you will have more money in the bank, probably your interest rates will be more reasonable. And therefore, all these collectively could contribute a lot as far as the economy is concerned.
Mr. Arun Jaitley, Finance Minister of India, thank you so much for joining us.